In this lesson, we're going to talk about Fibermesh. Fibermesh is a hair simulator that's built into ZBrush, and it allows you to create things like fur, spiny hairs, eyelashes, beards. You can also create things like leaves and grass, even protrusions like bulbous sort of tendrils that you might find on a virus or on a mold. So any type of object like that you can create using Fibermesh. Now, I want to show you what this looks like before we get started. Here I've got the Bogey Lady open, and she has some Fibermesh objects on her shoulders and head. Now, Fibermesh objects are preview objects. This is not what the final hair looks like. To see the final hair, we have to actually do a BPR render. Now, a couple things. I have changed the background color of my document by going to Document and then setting the background color here just by clicking and dragging over to the color swatch and selecting a nice mid-gray. Now you can also change the gradient because there is a range slider there. I'll turn that all the way down and turn center down. And you may also want to turn rate down, but that's not going to impact anything if there's no center and no range. The idea is I want to have a nice gray backdrop so I can actually see the hair that I'm working with. Otherwise, it's very hard to see it against a dark background. Now, I'm going to go ahead and render this. It'll take a little bit of time to render, and then we'll be able to see what those hairs look like. You'll also notice that once the render is complete, the corneal shell on the eyes will be transparent. And this is something we talk about in depth in the chapter on rendering in ZBrush. So if you happen to be going through the chapters out of order, which is a totally valid way to approach them, I just wanted to point that out to you that that is available for you to review, or if you haven't seen it yet, it is coming. So transparency for things like eyes, that's something you're going to see come into play once that render is complete, but it's not necessary for Fibermesh to work. Fibermesh simply requires that we have a Fibermesh object and we BPR render it to see what the final hair is actually going to look like. So with that said, I'm going to start rendering, and I will pause the recording because this will take a little bit of time to complete, and then I'll come back once it's finished and we can see what those hairs actually look like. And here we are. The render has completed, and you can see those hairs now take on a much nicer look. They don't have the jaggy quality anymore. They've got a nice sort of specular softness to them, and almost they feel much more like hair. And that's a result of the fact that Fibermesh objects are set up to render effectively through BPR. So how can we create our own Fibermesh? Well, let's take a look at that now. If we go to our tool menu here, I'm going to go back up to the top of the menu. And if you look under our poly grouping, we have a folder for hair. Now these are the Fibermesh preview objects here. So I'm going to delete these just by clicking the gear icon on this folder, and I'm going to click delete all, and that will delete all of those Fibermesh preview objects. Now let's go back to the body, make sure it is selected, and we'll move around here and then just paint some masks on here. I'm going to hold down the Control key and start painting a mask on the shoulder. Now, when you paint a mask, that's going to define where the Fibermesh is going to grow from. Fibermesh is driven by masking. So we'll start out just by creating a little patch right here on the shoulder. Now, I want to feather the mask edges because we can control the gradient or the fade off of the edges of the hair by the masking. So to do that, the easiest way to do that would be to go to our geometry menu here under the tool palette, under the tool menu, and just step down a couple subdivision levels, and then control click a few times on that mask, and it'll give us a nice feathered edge. Now we can step back up, and we'll get a nice gradient along the edge of that mask. So to create a Fibermesh, under the tool menu, you'll find a menu called Fibermesh right here. Now, there's a Lightbox Fibers menu. If you open this, it'll actually open up a Fibermesh preset. I'll show you how to set these up manually, but this is a great way to learn Fibermesh because all of these different types of objects here have been created using Fibermesh. You see that we've got grass, ferns, these sort of like viral proteins, long black hair, long brown hair, flowers even. So this is a wonderful way to learn all the different things you can do with Fibermesh just by opening one of these presets and sort of dissecting what the settings are doing. So I'm going to use this Fibermesh preset here, 142. If I double click on that, it's going to load that into the scene, but it's immediately far too long. So we're going to open up modifiers here. And you see preview is turned on. If I turn preview off, that preview mesh goes away. If I turn it on, the preview mesh will return. So the first thing I want to do is dial my length down. We'll bring that down to about 43. And I'll zoom into the shoulder here so you can see it. Now this is a preview of my Fibermesh object, which isn't in and of itself also a preview. Now what that means is this object doesn't exist as a subtool yet. The Fibermesh preview allows me to edit these settings, get this looking how I want it to look. We can even test it with the renderer here. And then once I'm happy with it, I can accept, and that will create a subtool, which is a Fibermesh object. Now the Fibermesh object, you can no longer edit these settings. You can groom it and move it around, but you can't change its fundamental settings. However, you can save a preset that you like by clicking the Save button here. And that Fibermesh preview, that Fibermesh object in the subtool menu, that is also a preview. As you saw at the beginning, when we don't BPR render, we just see the preview object. When we BPR render, we see the rendered hair. Okay? So let's go ahead and we've changed our length. Let's change the number of fibers. I'm going to take max fibers and turn this down because I don't want it to be like a furry sort of shoulder. I want these to be a little bit sparse like that. Now, as you're editing the hair, you might find the mask underneath to be distracting, in which case you can simply go to the masking menu, scroll down, and you'll find the masking menu, and just turn off View Mask. The mask is still there, you just don't see it. If we were to clear the mask by control clicking and dragging on the background, the hair would go away. So that's how you know that mask is still there. So I will go ahead and View Mask again, and go back and turn Preview on, and you see it remembers my settings. So let's turn View Mask off. Now I'd like these hairs to stick up a little bit more than this. There is a slider here for gravity. Gravity is set to 0.82. I'm going to turn this down, and gravity always pulls in the direction of screen down. Okay, so another way that I can approach this is if I wanted these hairs to stick straight up is I could just turn the model upside down like this, and then I could turn my gravity all the way back up, and that's going to pull those hairs straight up. So you can do this either way. I find it easier just to make sure that I'm looking at the character and the orientation that I'm accustomed to seeing it, and then adjusting those the gravity from there. So let's just turn this down a little bit so they're sticking out a bit. Now I feel like there's a little bit too much of a squiggle or a twist to the hairs. If you notice here under segments, segments are set to 11. If I turn segments down, I get fewer segments along the length of each hair. If I turn them up, I get more segments along each hair, and that can increase the resolution and the detail of the individual strands. So that's something to keep in mind, that your number of segments is going to have a direct influence on the overall texture of the hair if you come up here and edit some of these further settings. For example, let's go ahead and bring the length down just a little bit more here. And let's see, let's take the twist and set this to 0. And let's see, we've got clumps. I'm going to take clumps and turn this down to 0.21. And I'm going to turn down the variation. These sliders have a variance built into them as well. You will see other tools in ZBrush that have this. For example, Nanomesh has a variation slider for each slider, which just allows you to add randomness to the effects that you're getting. Now, you remember that I said I wanted the hairline to follow the feathered edge of my mask? Up here, I have the ability to turn by mask all the way up. And if I turn that all the way up, the mask is going to define the edge of that hairline. You see, if I do that, it brings it all the way out to the edge of the mask. If that's turning it down to 0. If I turn it back up to 5, it's going to feather or soften the edges of that hairline. So I'm going to set clumps back down to 0. And let's take revolve rate, make sure that's set to 0. I'm going to turn down, oops, let me set that back to 0. I'm going to take the focal shift and turn down our revolve radius. If I click this little close button here, I can close that. Now, if I take my revolve rate and turn this to a negative value, you see those hairs start to become curly. If I change that to a positive value, they become curly in the opposite direction. And then, of course, we have variations here because very rarely is every hair going to curl in the exact same direction. Now, we can change that radius by changing this graph or this curve here. So if I take that curve, and I'm using focal shift just to easily move the curve, I could also grab points on the curve like this, and then that's going to give us a fall off as to how far along the length of that hair that curl starts. If I turn this all the way down, it's going to take it a minute to update, and then add a point here. We can basically isolate that curve so it's happening more at the tips of the hair. Let's turn it down like this. There you can see what we get. If I bring that all the way down to here, if you watch the silhouette, you can see the change in the hair there. I can reset this just by clicking the reset button. That brings it back to its original state. And if I bring this dot all the way up and then go to my revolve rate and set that back to 0, I can remove those revolutions entirely. And again, to get rid of this, just click the close button. You'll also notice there's a texture assigned to this hair. So the texture is just what's going to give it its nice look once we render it. So that's good for our preliminary settings. Let's go ahead and do a render. I am going to go to my render settings here. And just because I've got transparency turned on those eyes, I'm going to turn that off, which will save us a little bit of time on our rendering. So I'm going to press the BPR render button, and that's going to render the settings that we just changed. And I encourage you to experiment and play with those settings because that's really the best way to learn Fibermesh, is tweak things, preferably on the presets, and see what effect they give you. And then you can start to create your own Fibermesh presets. There we go. You see how that softens, and we have this nice variation in the browns on the links of the hair. Plus, they cast a nice shadow once they're rendered. So let's go ahead and make a few more changes to this. We have our length setting here, and we've got length variation. Let's set the length variation to 0, and let's turn our length down a little bit more. And I will take my max fibers and bring those down even more. And we've got density variations here. I'm going to go ahead and set that to 0. So you see this adds just a whole patch of kind of squiggly little random hairs there that are a little bit creepy to see. Now we have coverage in percentage. Now this is an interesting slider. If I take this and change it from, let's say 3, I'll change this to 5. What happens here is it thickens the hair. If I bring this up to 37, it'll be very noticeable. Those hairs become very, very thick. And let's do a BPR render on that so you can see the effect that that has. Oftentimes, coverage doesn't do what people naturally think it would do. By thickening the individual hairs, it's actually very useful because you can use the coverage slider to create stalks and branches and vegetation as well as hair. So there you can see the effect that that's giving us, but they're little strips. These are little strips of polygons. If I zoom in, you can see what these look like. That's because of our profile here. We have max number of sides per profile. If I set my profile to 4, it's going to ask me if I want to render single-sided fibers as cylinders, say OK. And now that's going to give us these cylindrical forms here. Now under BPR settings, under preview settings, fast preview mode is turned off, and under BPR settings, you see that it's rendering 2 subdivisions. Now we can turn this up if the BPR is too jaggy or doesn't give us the effect that we want. Let's turn our length back up so we can maybe see these a little bit better once they render. So I'm going to click OK. Let's turn fast preview on. There we go. So fast preview is going to give us this preview mode, which is not necessarily as accurate. However, it's going to speed things up as we're moving around. So we brought that length up a little bit too high. Let's bring this back down. I'm going to skip that note. There we go. Bring that down. Fast preview. There we go. And let's go ahead and do a BPR render. You'll see that the fast preview mode is not quite as descriptive in the viewport as to what you're going to get when you actually do your render. But if you're working with a large section of hair with a lot of segments, that might be something that's valuable. So there you go. You see something like that can feel more like branches or tendrils or worms. There's quite a lot of different things that you can make using Fibermesh. So keep that in mind, that if you go in here and hack these settings, there's a whole bunch of different stuff that you can do. So let's go ahead and reset this. I'm going to go back to my coverage, turn this down, and let's go ahead and turn our length down. And now I'm going to click accept. Let's do one more render just so we can see the difference there. Now that I'm happy with my settings, remember this is just preview mode. None of this exists yet. These are all just preview meshes. In the same way that mesh extraction under the subtool menu gives you a preview before you commit to it, the Fibermesh menu will give you a preview before you actually commit to those changes. So we'll let this finish its BPR render, and then we'll take a look at what we get. So there we go. That's actually kind of a nice little downy kind of squiggly hair on the shoulder. So I will click accept, and I will say always yes, and there we go. Let's go back up to our subtools here and turn visibility back on the body. And I will go down to my masking menu. Don't forget that you had view mask turned off. So if I alt click on the body to select it, just make sure that the mask has been cleared. So there we go. This is now our Fibermesh preview object. You see it as a separate subtool. And what this means is that we could take something like the move brush, for example, or the grooming brushes, and we can shift these hairs and we can adjust them using either just the standard move brush, or we could also use the grooming brushes, which we'll look at in a minute. So I can come through here and just make changes to the overall flow of the hair or the way they're sitting. And by default, fiber meshes are masked at the root. If you want to move the root of the fiber mesh, simply go to the brush menu, go to auto masking, and here you'll find a button called auto mask fiber mesh. If I turn that off, my move brush will now grab the entire fiber mesh, which may or may not be useful. If I'm doing something like eyelashes, I find that really handy to be able to just go in there and actually move the fiber mesh, fiber root and all. So let's take a look now at how to do this from scratch. All right, I'm going to open up a new scene. We'll clear out all of our fiber mesh settings, and then we'll start a beard on a character from the ground up. And this will also show us how we can use fiber mesh to create a more complex hair structure. Not like just hair on someone's shoulder. How do we create something like a beard? Well, oftentimes people try and do that all in one go. Well, that's not the way to approach it, and we'll see why in just a moment. So here we have a new scene open, and we've got our ogre model. And what we want to do is we want to create a beard on this character. Now, the natural inclination is often just to mask out a whole area where you want there to be hair. But that's actually not the way you want to do it. We want to treat this the same way that you would treat creating a wig or a ventilated hairpiece if you were a makeup artist for film or stage. The hair is laid on layer by layer based on how it grows. So we would have a section of hair here at the chin. we'd have a section of hair here at the lower corner of the mouth, a section here, and a section here, and so on. The idea is that these sections of hair grow over one another and blend together. Now, that gives you the ability to groom the hair more effectively because you can work section by section. Plus, it looks a lot more realistic because those sections of hair lay on top of one another in a natural manner. So let's take a look at how to do this. And in the process, we're going to create a brand new hair preset. So I'm going to start by masking out the chin. And I'll just control-click on that mask a few times to clear or to feather the edge. We'll go to Fibermesh. And under Fibermesh, instead of opening up the Fibermesh light box, we're just going to start from scratch and create a brand new Fibermesh. So let's go ahead and open up Modifiers and turn on Preview. And that's going to give us the preview of just the default fibers. So let's go ahead and turn the length up. Let's turn the coverage, or excuse me, the maximum fibers down so we've got fewer fibers. I want this hair to be a little bit scraggly in the beard. Now you see that these are sticking out almost like spines. Well, you remember that I said that we have segments. We don't have enough segments in there. The more segments we have, the more ability gravity has to affect that hair. So let's go ahead and add a little bit more length here. And let's reduce the number of fibers by turning down max fibers. Maybe not quite that much. Give it a little bit more. And there we go. So there's our first section of hair. I will click Accept. Say always yes. And now if we come back to our subtools, you can see we have a Fibermesh object. It is selected by default for the chin. Now I'm going to Alt-click on the head to select that, clear the mask by Control-clicking and dragging on the background, and let's go ahead and draw our next section of hair. And I'm going to let this one overlap the previous one. That's going to help them blend together. Control-click to feather the edges. And then let's go ahead and go back to Fibermesh, Preview, and it's going to remember my settings. So now I'm going to take the length, turn the length down, and let's adjust our gravity. I want this hair just to sort of stick out a little bit more than the hair underneath it, or stick out a little bit more so it matches better to the hair section underneath it that we just did. So I'm going to go to gravity, and I'm going to turn my gravity down just a tiny bit, and that's going to give us a little bit more spring in that hair. And you can see it's a little long. I don't want it to be quite so long. And I think I want a few more fibers. So let's turn that up. And let's turn our length down. There we go. Now I will click Accept. And if we go back to our subtools, we now have two Fibermesh objects here. So let's go ahead and just do a preview of this and see what this looks like. I'm going to clear the mask that's on the head. And let's go ahead and click BPR. BPR is going to render those fibers and show us what it looks like as actual hair rather than this preview object. So we'll let that finish, and we should have our hair now. There we go. You see, that gives us a really nice, realistic looking hair. The shadows here are not doing us any favors in terms of being able to see what we're looking at. So let's go back to the light menu here, and I'm going to grab this light and just bring it over here. Grab the key light, bring this down here, so we've got kind of an even lighting. We'll take that secondary light, and it's set to 0.3. Let's set that to 0.5. And I'm going to go to the render settings, BPR shadow, and I'm going to take the global shadow strength and just turn it down a little bit. And I'm going to take my rays and set these to 20. Now let's do our next section of hair, which will be on the sides of the mouth here. Holding down the Control key, I'll make a new mask, making sure always that the mask overlaps the previous mask. That's what's going to give you a nice blend between the hair objects, is if those two sections overlap one another. If I turn on solo mode, I can see exactly what I'm going to get here. Control click to feather the edges. And if you don't get a nice feather, remember you can press Shift D to step down a subdivision level, and that will help you feather that mask more effectively. So I'll turn solo off. And let's go back to Fibermesh preview. And it's going to remember the previous settings. So you can see that's blending in, but let's make the hair a little bit more sparse as it comes up the cheeks. So I'm going to take the max fibers and turn that down to, let's say, about 10. There you go. So you see it starts to get a little bit less sort of full and springy. And maybe let's bring this down to 8.5. There we go. And when I'm happy with that, I'll click Accept. Alt-click on the head. Control-click drag on the background to clear the masking, and let's put in our next section of hair here. Now, I don't want to do the entire mustache in one go. I'm going to step down a subdivision level and feather the edges of this mask, and then step back up and preview. Now, gravity's pulling these hairs straight down. Of course, I can go to my gravity settings here, and I can turn the gravity down, and that will give them a little bit more spring. And when we start grooming, we can move these fibers manually over. So don't worry too much. I want to get the spring of the hair and the general direction of the hair, more or less, but I'm not going to try and groom it in the preview. I'll groom it using brushes later. So I can render this if I want to see what this is going to look like, or click Accept, and then Alt-click on the head, clear the mask, and then let's do a render. So the more fibers we get, it can slow the render down a little bit, but usually it's pretty good. Also, it's interesting to note that Fibermesh does render in KeyShot. So if you have the KeyShot bridge and a copy of KeyShot, you can render Fibermesh inside of KeyShot. Fibermesh also can be exported as curves, which you can use to drive hair simulators outside of ZBrush. So you could set up a hair simulation here inside of ZBrush, export curves, and then use that in XGen and Maya, for example. So it's a nice way to get a good-looking groom of hair either inside of ZBrush or outside. So don't forget that you can actually use it elsewhere. And I'll show you those export settings in a moment. So this render is now complete. You see that we're getting this nice, soft kind of hair simulation here for the beard. And you can already see there where I need to move that hair over so those blend in a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and move the model, and that's going to clear that render out. And let's take a look at what happens if we were to move this before we complete the beard. If I go to the Move brush, if I want any brush to effectively be a grooming brush, all I need to do is go to the brush menu, go to Fibermesh, and I'll turn Preserve Length all the way up. Now I can adjust other things like forward propagation. That makes the brush affect from the root to the tip. Inverse will invert that, so the brush affects from the tip to the root. And I can also adjust the stiffness here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn Preserve Length all the way up so I don't change the length of these. And make sure you're not on the head, make sure you're on the actual Fibermesh object that we just created, which is this one here, last in the list. Oops, nope. Last in the list is the first one. There we go. There you go, right there. Now this is interesting. You see we've got a little bit of a better view now. You can see how it's growing straight down. Now we want to fix that. So I find one of the easiest things to do is when I want to move hair, to simply take the Move brush and move it exactly where I want it. I'll just take this, move that over into the other hair. Now remember, under auto masking, auto mask Fibermesh is on, so I'm not going to accidentally change something like the root. Those are going to stay preserved. If I come back up here, bring my stiffness down, you see that it no longer has that stiff quality as we're moving it. That might be a little bit difficult to see, but if you experiment with that slider, you'll see the difference as you start moving hair sections around if you change the stiffness values. So we'll bring this and just let that blend into the other fibers there. I'm going to Alt-click on the head, and let's go ahead and press the Control key, and we'll put in the last section of hair here. Let's turn on solo so we can see this a bit better. And I'm just going to mask out this whole section. I'm going to be careful not to get it up into the nasolabial fold there. Step down a couple subdivision levels and just feather this mask a bit more. There we are. Step back up our subdivisions and turn solo off. And now go to Fibermesh Preview. And let's turn down our max fiber so it's getting real scraggly there towards the center. That's got a nice look about it. Maybe we'll turn the length up just a little bit. Oops, that's max fibers. Let's turn the length up just a little bit. There we go. And I'll click Accept. Let's clear that mask and then do a render to see what we get. The progress is working its way along. As you can see, it does take longer with each successive addition of more fibers. They can increase your render time. And there we go. So now you can see that we've got the thinner hair up here at the midpoint of the face. It starts to soften down here around the edges. So it's quite a nice look that we've got going on here. Let's go ahead and grab this secondary light, and I'm just going to set this to 1. I just want to get a nice looking overall render here, or overall lighting condition, so we can see things a bit better. And I'm going to go to the Move Brush. It's going to remember my settings, preserve length. And I'm going to go to my subtools and make sure that I'm on the most recent groom object. And I'll just scooch these over just a little bit and integrate those into the other bit of hair there. And this side as well. Now remember, your Fibermesh settings can't be changed once you've committed to creating the Fibermesh object. Once you accept it, it is what it is at that point. You can always go back and create a new one. You can delete a Fibermesh object like you would delete any other subtool. There we go. Now let's say I want to create some spiky hair. Maybe he's got a strip of hair running down the center of his head here. I'll draw a mask right there. Control click on that a few times to feather it. And let's go to Fibermesh Preview. And I actually quite like the look of that, but let's say we want it to be longer. I will go to the length slider here, turn that up. I'm going to go to gravity, and if I set that to 0, that hair will stand straight up. If I want it to be very, very spiky, I can reduce my segments. It's not necessary to have a lot of segments if you're trying to create a very spiny hair. So it's totally valid to actually turn these down if need be, or turn them up to get a little bit more variation. So let's take a look now at some of our other settings. If I go to the Export Curves button here, that's what I was telling you before, you can export curves. So this is valuable if you want to export this hair as curves and then use that in Maya. I'm going to go ahead and click Accept. Now I'm going to BPR Render, and we'll see the resulting spiky hair on top of the head. And there you go. There you can see the effect that we get. Now I can go in my preview settings before I commit to any of these Fibermesh objects, and I can assign textures to them. I can change their coloration. We'll take a look at changing the color of fibers in our next demonstration. But on this hair object here, on the head, if I go to B for brush, G for groom, here we have access to our groom brushes. So we've got groom strong, we've got groom clumps. My personal favorite is groom turbulence. I like that because it sort of tussles the hair, and it adds sort of a very realistic kind of, how should you say, I suppose, randomness to the hair. So we can bring this over. You see it sort of creates something that actually feels like tousled hair like this, like it's sitting down. I'm going to go ahead and undo that, turn my Z intensity down. There we go. And I'm going to take the Move brush, and then we can take that and we can just literally place it where we want it. And it's not going to impact the root system. The roots are going to stay exactly where we want them. So do that, and then we'll render this. Oops. I'm going to change my lighting. I felt like that was a bit too strong last time. And I'm going to go to render. I'm going to turn my angle down just a little bit on my shadow. And there we go. We'll do another render here so we can see the result of that. I think Groom Turbulence is probably my favorite grooming brush. And the grooming brushes can be challenging. The best advice that I can give you based on the way I use them is I use the groom brush to sort of massage the shapes of the hair, but I do most of my shifting the hair using the move brush. And if I need to gather hair together, I will use like the groom ball brush, for example. That'll gather and twist the hair together. So there's a variety of different ways to approach using Fibermesh. But I think the number one thing that people often neglect is that you can literally just use any brush as long as you turn on that preserve length slider or adjust those Fibermesh settings. So there you see that just gives us a really nice kind of realistic feeling tousling to that hair. We'll do one more section. I'm going to just do a section here. I'm going to do it a bit larger. I'm going to alt-click on the head so that's selected. Make sure my X symmetry is turned off. And we'll do another little section of hair right here. Anytime I do any sort of hair object, I always do it in sections. I never really try and do an entire head of hair as a single object. That's just not a good idea. Let's go ahead and preview that. And this time I'm going to scale my fibers up by using the coverage slider. I'm going to take coverage to, that might be a little too much. Let's set that to 17. And let's take our length, turn it down just a little bit, and I'm going to zero out the length variation, so that's all about the same length. Click Accept. Now I'm going to go back to my Groom Turbulence brush. And now we can just brush this over. I'm just brushing straight through that hair, bringing it down. Remember that I did turn down my Z intensity, so I can turn that up a little bit. And it really does behave just like you're brushing through hair. You literally start at the top and just pull your stroke down. And there's just something about this Groom Turbulence brush, like I said, I just really like it. The texture that it gives the hair is really cool. This kind of looks like the haircut that Mo from the Three Stooges had. So let's bring that. I like that little randomness up there in the hair. Now, some of these brushes can be really intense. If I go to B for brush, G for groom, and grab, for example, we can grab the just groom brush 1. You see, this is very, very strong. Can have quite an intense effect. So as I pull that straight down, it's almost slicking it down, as you can see. Now, this can be good to sort of force the hair into a direction or a shape. And then, so I'll show you, if we do this and sort of force that hair into a specific kind of shape, let's get that pulled straight across, straight across, straight across, just like that. Okay. And I'll turn my brush size down. Let's grab these, grab the move brush. Once again, I can finesse the shape using move, and also you can take the smooth brush, turn up preserve length on that, and you can do some smoothing on areas that are being a problem. So don't forget that. So let's go ahead and move this down, and now I'll go to my Groom Turbulence brush. So I like to use the Groom Turbulence brush on top of where I have actually gotten more or less the shape that I want, and then that helps create a little bit more realistic texture to that hair once you've actually laid it in. There we go. I'm going to bring these little bits of hair down. I'm going to alt-click on this hair object here, and I'm just going to bring these down as well. Let these sort of fall forward on the head. I find it funny that every time I put hair on this particular orc or ogre in my demonstrations, He always ends up with this very sort of strange kind of alternative haircut. Like, looks like he's probably really into bands that you've never heard of. Or he was into that before it was cool. There we go. We'll move that around. Now, because I have preserve length turned on, I can't change the length. But just to show you, if I turn that down, I can actually stretch Fibermesh. I don't recommend it. I don't find that it's always very predictable. Another interesting thing is the snake hook brush, which you might not expect. If you take the snake hook brush and turn preserve length up, oh, and make sure you turn your RGB off. We can use this to sort of create a little calic like this. If I want this hair to sort of twist out like this. This is really good for adding little flicks to the hair. Like that. And then I'll go back to my groom turbulence, turn my Z intensity down, and literally all you have to do is just touch that hair and it's going to put turbulence into it. It's going to give you the twisting of those fibers, as you can see right there. Now, Fibermesh can be used for so many things. I have an image that I use, or a demo that I use in some of the other chapters where I make a pillow with a fringe on it. And that was created, that pillow fringe, that was created using Fibermesh. I'll open that and show you in a moment. So there we go. So with grooming, it's really just about selecting the appropriate brush for the groom you're trying to get, and then making sure that you utilize it in conjunction with the move brush or any other brushes with that preserve length turned all the way up, or as close to up as you can. So any brush can be a grooming brush. So there we go. I'll show you that pillow that I'm talking about, how we can create textile objects using Fibermesh. And here we've got that scene that I was talking about with the pillow, and we've got a skull with a little floral crown on here. These flowers were actually created using the cloth tools in ZBrush 2021, as was the pillow. Now, the tassels here, these are created using Fibermesh, and this is just a great way to show you what you can do that's not hair and fur. So if I just do a quick BPR render, we can take a look at what these look like when they're actually rendered. It's going to look considerably different than what you see here because, again, these are just the preview objects, and these are all contained inside the tassels here and in the pillow folder. I have the Fibermesh subtools in there. So we'll let this finish rendering. And there we go. You can see these become these large sort of braided, twisted bits of sort of upholstery detailing, as opposed to those spindly little objects that we were seeing before. So how did we create those? Well, let's go to the light box and open up a polysphere. I'll just go to Tool, open up Polysphere, and I will show you how these were actually created. Let's turn on X symmetry, and I'm going to create a mask. Let's just do a mask running right around the center of the sphere, just like so. So we've got a mask on here now, and I will go to the Fibermesh settings and preview. Now, I have a preset that I created for those twisting bits of hair, and I've saved this out so you can load it up with the project files for this particular chapter. If I go to Open and then browse to Tassel Fibers, you can see this loads up my preset. Now you see there's some new settings here. We've got a base color and we have a tip color. We also have the coverage turned up, and we have our revolve changed. So let's take a look at what these look like. If I open up revolve radius, you see it's set straight across. Now we looked at that briefly earlier, but if I look at my revolve rate, it's at 87.21. If I turn this down to 0 and just skip that note, they'll become straight lines. You see that? If I turn them negative, they're going to twist the opposite direction. So let's turn it back up and twist those this way. Let's reduce our fibers. So we're at 3. Let's turn this down so we can see each individual one a little bit better. So our length is fine. I'm going to take my gravity, maybe turn the gravity down a little bit so these stick out. So they're a little bit easier to discern from one another than if they were all clumped up together. Coverage is scaling, and I've got scale root and scale tip. Scale root is set to 1, scale tip is set to 0.01. Were I to turn this up, the tips would be scaled up larger, which is something we're going to do, but not for this particular demonstration. I'll set that back down to 0.01. So our max fibers we've got turned down. We have our coverage turned up, which is going to thicken those. That's set to, I think, 2088. If I dropped that down, you see those would become thinner. Our revolve rate is going to revolve those. Our gravity is set as we have it here. Let's come up here and notice that our segments are set to 42 and our profile is set to 6. Now that's important. If I brought the profile down to 2 and brought the segments down from 42, it's not going to be all that clear what we're going to get. If I bring the segments back up, bring the profile back up, now we can actually see the resulting twist from the revolve. If I turn that segment up even higher, you see what we get. So let's go to our revolve radius here, and it's set to 116.9. If I turn this up, we get that. And take our twist. Our twist is set to 42. If I set twist to 0, look what happens. It effectively straightens everything out. Let's turn revolve radius down too. That just gives us a straight tube. Let's turn our segments down. There we go. Now let's turn our twist back up. Let's come back up here to twist, turn twist up. Now you see we're starting to twist that hair, but it's not really clear what we're getting. So let's turn our segments up. There we go. And then we've got our revolve. If we turn our revolve up, that's going to give us the sort of squiggly rotational axis quality that we were getting before. Now for my base and tip color. So the base color I have here, so I've got base colorize set to 1. If I turn base colorize down to 0 or close to 0, it's not going to colorize. If I turn it all the way up, it will give me a nice colorization there. I have the tip colorized, and then I've got the profile set like so. If I were to add another point here and adjust this curve, that changes the rate of that color. So this is the base color. The base is the default. And as long as that's down to 0, you're getting the base color. And as soon as that curve comes up, we get the tip color. So here I can control how close to the tip that color occurs. Let's say I want them to be red in the center. Or excuse me, orange in the center. I can do this. So this will give me orange in the center and red on the tips. BPR will give us a best preview render so we can see what it looks like. And there we go. So we can increase the number of twists there. Let's do our revolve rate, turn these up, get a tighter revolve there. Let's turn up our variation on that. And let's turn our twist up. And let's go back down to our segments. And let's do another render, and you'll see the difference that we get. So this is a good example of how you can use Fibermesh, as I said, to create something entirely different than what you might be thinking of using Fibermesh to do. So in keeping with that, let's take a look at one more demo. Let's look at using Fibermesh to make spines like you'd find on an insect. I'm going to go back up to my tools here, and we'll switch over to this one here. Call this one Scorpio. You see he's got all these nasty little insectoid spines along his body. If I do a BPR render of this, you'll see the effect that we get on those spiny hairs there. I really like adding little details like this to creatures. You can also just add an overall layer of downy like hair, like body hair onto something to get that peach fuzz if you want an added look of realism. But that's not something that we would do on an insectoid-like creature like this. So we want to make little spiny hairs like this. So I will go to my subtools and I will select the fibers and delete them. And let's zoom into the head. We'll put our fibers on the head here. So as before, I'm just going to mask out where I want these spiny hairs to grow from. And I'll just mask out the whole top of this head here. There we go. And I'll feather the edges of that mask. And now we'll go to Fibermesh. And let's turn on preview. And it's going to bring up the Fibermesh presets for this particular tool because it's saved with the tool. So I'm just going to go ahead and step back through these. I don't actually want them to be quite this dense. So what we'll do is we will take our max fibers and turn these down. There we go. And I'm going to go to my segments. And I might turn the segments down to, let's set it to just 4. There you go. See, that gives us a nice spiny kind of hair. Now, of course, our length is too long. Let's turn these down a bit. Now, we could do a variety of them. We could have our length variations turned up like this, something like a spider. But if you look at a lot of macro photography of insects, sometimes it seems like the different lengths are sort of arranged together in a relatively organized way. The best person to go to for that sort of thing is Eric Keller and his videos on this website, Gnomon Workshop, on creating realistic insects in ZBrush. So I've laid out these spines. Now I want to give them some thickness. So I'm going to go to Scale Root. Let's turn Scale Root up. Let's turn Coverage up. Now coverage again is going to give me a thicker sort of spine. And I'm going to set profile a little bit higher. There we go. Let's scale root down. Now as we scale the root and tip, we can change the relationship between the width at the base and the width at the end. So let's go back here and scale our tip. Let's turn that tip down. And let's slim this down a little bit. And I don't want any revolutions. I don't really want any twist either, so let's turn the twist down. And if I set the gravity to 0, it's going to make them stick straight up. But I've given it a tiny little bit of gravity so we can have just a little bit of curve to them. And let's actually reduce the max fibers even more. Let's make them... There we go. Now let's give that a test render with BPR and see what that looks like. This might be good, but I think that we can get them better. Yeah, I want them, these feel more like quills. So I want there to be a little bit of a difference in the profile going along the length. Oh, incidentally, here you see I've got noise in the gravity curve. So we have the gravity control here, which we've used before, but if we open up the gravity profile, I have noise turned on this. If I were to turn this noise down, you can see the effect that that gives it. If I were to change the gravity curve like this, you can see that we can start to add sort of a nuance to the direction. I can also flip this horizontally, or actually let's do this. Let's, oops, let me undo that. Let's flip this vertically. There we go. So you can see the impact that that will have. Let's bring this down. Bring this down. And you can see that we can start curving those hairs in the other direction. So let's go ahead and close that gravity curve. And let's go back to our scale root. And let's turn that up. And I'm going to go to my width profile. And watch what happens if I take this point and bring it down. The end gets very, very small. If I turn it up, the end gets bigger. Then if I bring this down, I can have a much more extreme kind of spike. So there, oops. Let me bring this back up and bring this back down. There we go. So now that's feeling much more like a spine, like we might get on a spider leg. I'm going to go to my color profile, and I want that deeper red to be more apparent along the length of it. So now let's do a render. So there we go. That's looking much, much better. Maybe we want to increase the max fibers to about maybe 0.35. And then I will click accept. So now we've got our first set of sort of spines there. We can do another set on the, let's say on the arm here. Let's go ahead and create a mask just along this edge of the arm. And we can use the same preset. If I turn on Fibermesh Preview, it's going to remember my settings, but maybe we want these to be a little bit longer on the body. So I'll turn, oops, that's max fibers. Let's turn that back down. Let's turn the length up on these. So these can be a lot longer. We'll turn our max fibers down even further though. And then this time I want to give them a little bit of curvature. So I'm going to rotate the body like this, and I'm going to give it a little bit more gravity. Just a little bit more gravity to pull those down so we can curve those a little bit more. Now, we don't have a lot of segments here, so the higher my gravity, the less it actually has to work with in terms of bending those. So if I were to increase the segments just a little bit, now you see we're starting to get an even more pronounced curve, but also look at what it's doing to the base. It's scaling the base up more profoundly. That is because I have scale root turned up. If I turn scale root down, you see those will get smaller. Let's do a quick render and see what this looks like, having the roots scaled like this, because it's important to sort of understand the difference between what you see in the preview and what you see in the final render. So there you go. You can see the difference in that. We lose our faceting, but we still have that quite a strong base there. So I'll take my scale root and turn this back down. I actually do want that root scaled up, but not quite that much. Now if we do a render, you'll see what we get. So you'll see that they almost look like little quills or spines. There you go. So we get that. Now we go to our BPR settings. Remember, we can control the number of subdivision smoothness that we get. If those feel too faceted, I can turn this up and then redo my render, and that will change the look of each individual fiber. Usually that's most important if you're doing things like leaves and grass or something that you're quite close to, but it is good to note that this is here. And that is just controlling the number of times each fiber is subdivided, but only at render time. So let's go ahead and go back to our color profile here, and let's reset this. Flip it vertically. We can give a little bit of a difference to these particular hairs. There we go. I just want to get a little bit more red along the length of those. And we go back to our profile is 4, segments are 8. Very good. So I'm going to go ahead and click accept. And now we've got these real creepy spines along the side of the body. So that's how we can actually create insectoid-like spines on an object. Again, it doesn't always have to just be hair. It can be any number of different sorts of things. One last thing that I'll show you how to do is create the protein stalks that you would see on a virus. And this is something that I used when I was working on the COVID pneumonia image that I've shown you some elements from that throughout this series of videos. And you might have seen me do that on ZBrush Live. I go through the entire design process of the creature and sculpting for ZBrush for Pixelogic's live feed on their YouTube page. But if you imagine the fiber or the protein fibers that come off of a virus, we can create those using Fibermesh. I'll just turn on preview and I'm going to reset these settings. Now, unfortunately, there is no reset button here. So you're just going to have to manually reset things. Or if you were to create a new object, let's say I go to my tool palette here and go to a polymesh star and turn this into a polysphere and divide this a couple times, mask it, and then preview, we get a reset setting there. So what I will do is I will turn my max fibers down, and I'm going to really turn these down. There we go. And I'm going to take coverage and turn coverage up. I want these to be quite big. And I'm going to go to my profile, and I need at least 4 along my profile so I can actually see the tubes that we're getting. I'm going to turn my segments up, and I'm going to set gravity very importantly at 0, so these are sticking straight out. And I will turn the length up. And let's come down here to twist and set twist to 0. And we've got revolve set to 0. Coverage, length. And I think we could do with fewer of these. So I'm going to take the density variation, set that to 0. And I'm going to turn down the number of these that I've got. I'm going to turn the length down again and make sure that my length variation is also set to 0. So they're all roughly about the same size. There we go. And let's go back to our gravity profile. Let's reset this. Back up to gravity. Set that to 0. There we go. So that should not be affecting it. And I'm going to go to my revolve and my twist. So first off, I'm going to add a twist to this. Don't want too much twist, just a little bit. And now I'm going to go to scale tip, and I'm going to turn scale tip up. And this is going to give me those nice bulbs that you get at the end of the viral stalks. So while we're doing this, let's go ahead and just add some color. I'm going to turn off preview, and I'm going to go to a bit of color here, go to RGB, color, fill object, and let's turn preview back on. And let's go to our base color here. Let's give that a light red. Tip color, we'll give that a darker red. Now this is actually flipping right now, so I'm going to reset this. So now that's more in line with what I'm expecting to see. Let's give that a quick render. And it's not quite what I'm looking for yet. So what I will need to do is, let's go to our scale root, scale tip here. And I'm going to go to my width profile. And I want to change this so they get bigger. Like this. So this is going to add that bulbous quality to the end. Let's take our scale tip, maybe turn that down just a little bit. And I don't want it to be quite so thin, so let's bring this up. Scale root. Set this to 1. Let's reset that curve. There we go. See, I'm trying to get this nice bulbous quality. So we need to make sure that our profile curve here helps us get that. So if I turn this all the way up, the tip is going to get very big. But I remember I want it to be kind of bulbous, so I need there to be a little bit of a bulge here, and then this will come back down like this. So we get something along these lines. And I might take my rotation, my twist, and turn that down just a little bit to start. And let's go to slim. Now that's going to work just as it is. Let's go ahead and collapse this cavity, or the profile there. And my revolve rate is 0. Let's turn that up. There we go. Now let's render. So there you see that we can get these really, really interesting shapes there, but I'm not quite getting, I've still got this sort of squared off tip that I don't want. So I'm just going to come down to my profile settings here. We've got 4. Let's turn up our previews and let's go to our tip. Let's scale the tip down. There we go. So what we've done is we have the tip now scaled down, but we've got our width profile giving us the bulge that we want. So with the tip scaled down, I am able to not have that big flat plane on the very, very end. So let's zoom out just a little bit so we can see it and give it a quick render. And there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and accept that. And then I will make sure that the sphere is selected, clear that mask, and then go ahead and fill that color fill object. So now you can see that we can create all sorts of different types of objects, different types of shapes, just using Fibermesh. So we've used Fibermesh to create hair, we've used it to create textiles, we've used it to create spines on a spider, and now these sort of protein stalks in a virus. So anything along those lines that you might find that you need to create, Fibermesh is a really good viable tool for doing that. Any type of simulated instance sort of procedural geometry along those lines, you can probably generate it with Fibermesh. So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and you can see ways that you can start putting hair and fur and spines and all sorts of other things on your own creatures and characters. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.